as we're doing it. And I, as we're talking about this, we're trying to just move on with this. And I want to welcome everybody to Before I Die. This is a conversation about death and dying. I'm Steve Willey. I'm here with Yanana Rose Zovich. And Before I Die is a regular monthly series about how death can invite us to live deeper, richer, and more meaningful lives. To that end, this month, we are here to talk about tending the spirit at the end of life.
And we are here today with Buddhist Reverend Mark Bloodgood. Hi, Mark. Mark is a former colleague of both of ours and also a good friend. And I'd love it if we could just start off today by you telling us a little bit about yourself, about the work that you do, and about yourself as a person, whatever you'd like to share, so we can get to know you a little bit.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Nice to be invited.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And fun to be back at Hospice, Wilshire Hospice. Well, I am ordained Zen Buddhist priest and teacher. And this is mostly out of what we call the Soto tradition. So in Zen, there are two major schools that are survived, the Rinzai and the Soto. And I kind of am more affiliated with the Soto school. And I started training for that, 23 years ago down at the Zen Center of Los Angeles. And you go through stages. You work very closely with a teacher. And it's up to that teacher about when you're going to graduate and have eventually transmission. And so during the course of those 23 years, I started a sitting group, meditation group here in San Luis Obispo, which I kept up, but traveling down to the Zen Center of Los Angeles for my training literally every weekend.
Yeah,
and it was dual purpose.
Yeah.
I had aging parents that I was taking care of and doing this training as well. And so eventually, the things opened up. I got transmission, and now I'm spending almost all my time here with the local group, San Luis Obispo Zen Circle.
Yeah, well, remember when we worked together, you were always back and forth somewhere. You were in LA, or you were here, you were working, you were with your folks. It was a busy time, but we just reconnected recently, and you have just about the same amount of busyness in your schedule, but it's mostly here.
Yeah.
Right? So,
Yeah.
Well, welcome. Thanks for making time for us today.
Of course.
How
can you say no to Steve?
And both Yanana and I agreed when we were casting this little time together that you would be ideal to come, because we both wanted to see you anyway. So thanks for coming in. Just to kind of get us off the ground here, so to speak, and talking about tending the spirit at the end of life. And when we talk about that, I think what we're talking about is kind of a general spirituality at the end of life. How does spirituality enter into end of life work, end of life practice? How does spirituality enter into our own lives as we near the end of our lives? So this is a pretty broad topic, and probably we won't even begin to really get it completely talked about today. But I thought we maybe just start talking about your ideas about how you approach spirituality at the end of life. I'm thinking about your time as a spiritual counselor here, but also now. I'm sure that you have opportunities in your life now to present in with the people that you work with, the people that you care for spiritually.
Yes.
I know.
Including myself.
Longest question ever.
Including myself. I'm 73 now. And as my dad used to always say, I've got many more years behind me than I have ahead of me. Yeah. So it's kind of, get prepared. Yeah. And that's one of the, in my faith tradition, that's one of the tenets is impermanence of life. And we talk about practicing as though there is a fire upon your head. Don't waste this precious time. And I remember hearing the Dalai Lama, this is many, many years ago, And he said the one regret he was having was not preparing for his own death enough. And so that's our encouragement is don't wait till the end. So we promote getting prepared. And Stephen Levine, I think you remember some of his works, and he has a great book, A Year to Live.
Yeah.
So we do these classes where you basically, it's as if you have been given a year to live. You've been given notice that you've just got one more year to live. What are you going to do? And it's this whole workshop and planning and dealing with everything for end of life. Emotional, spiritual, of course, legal. I always bring my attorney in, and he scares the heck out of people with end of life stories, true stories.
I bet.
When things happen legally, I mean, some crazy, crazy stories. So I'm not even sure that answers your question, but
we're on the way.
Okay.
We're on the way.
Yeah. When you do those Year to Live workshops, are they typically, do you space them out for a year? Do you follow Stephen Levine's plan and do year-long workshops that way, or how do you?
Year-long, right.
Yeah.
And as I said, lots of it meditation. We do, they used to have the monks at charnel grounds meditating, amongst the deceased to get that kind of feeling. Sometimes we'll pursue sitting in a cemetery as an example. But yeah, it's to deal with all aspects of it.
Tell me one more time the metaphor of that having the fire on your head. Is that what you said? That you're to practice is that you have a fire on your head. That
So wouldn't that motivate you?
It would. I love the urgency of that. I mean, that's really what we're doing. That's kind of our probably not very subtle plan of having this series Before I Die, was really to sort of open people up to a more mindful preparation for death.
Well, and just getting comfortable talking about it, right? So, like Steve and I will have lunch and talk about our experience in hospice and laugh and feel emotional and and all of it, and it's very normal in terms of our ability to talk about it. But we have this sort of subversive desire to change the culture around death and dying. In terms of making people more comfortable talking about it. Like, shouldn't we be able to talk about death and dying like we talk about food, for example, right? And that whole idea of like, don't discuss, religion or sex or death around the dinner table. We're just pushing back on that one and trying to normalize it, right? In our little way.
In our little way.
And that's the whole motivation about this series and inspired by that book, A Year to Live by Stephen Levine as well.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
So in my experience, I'm just kind of bringing it around to sort of the spirituality aspect at the end of life and what that means for different people. I don't know about the two of you, but when people know I work for hospice, or I have worked for hospice, for quite a long time, I often get asked the question when talking about faith and spirituality and religion. I often get asked the question, and it's actually more of a comment than a question, where people will say, if you have a strong faith, you're going to get through this dying process a lot easier, that it's going to make things easier if you have a deep faith and you believe in certain things, that it's not going to be as challenging or as painful or as frightening as it is for somebody who doesn't have a faith in their life or a specific spirituality of any kind. What are your thoughts on that, Mark?
We're not supposed to swear, right?
No.
But that's bull. It's every patient, every person is different. I had a number of Alzheimer's dementia care homes here in the county, and there was a great consultant in Santa Barbara County who used to say, and these were only for dementia patients, and this consultant down in Santa Barbara said, when you've met one person with Alzheimer's, you've met one person with Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just totally different. So I've seen people with a really strong spiritual faith slide through it very well, that it is grounding for them, very supportive for them. But I've had others, likewise, who have a strong faith tradition that have spiritual pain at the end of death or at the end of life. So it's certainly case by case.
Right.
Some people go out in a very messy way, and some go out smoothly, serenely.
It's kind of like the way we live our lives, I guess.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And before, I know that Yana was talking about the hospice, and I think that's what the hospice movement has done, is getting this out. And I think we've made this country, we've made a lot of headway
Yeah.
toward that.
Yeah, I do too. I mean,
I
it
think it's
feels
a
like
good
there's
thing.
a long way to go. Absolutely. I know you worked in this field. I've only worked in this field for about 8 years. But I would say over the past decade, it's hard to tell when you're in it, right? 'Cause
Exactly.
this is clearly, I see a lot of people who are comfortable talking about it. And I want to sort of be clear. I don't mean comfortable talking about it as in we're not concerned or in pain at the thought of, losing our loved ones or losing this life. Like I always, Steve and I, we kind of joke about it, but I always go, yeah, I'm really comfortable talking about death and dying, but not mine. Right? Like, I just want to make clear, like, I'm completely not at peace with this dying thing. The whole mortality thing, it really rubs, but I do like to talk about it. And that's sort of, that's kind of the difference, right? Like, I've said this a couple times on this series so far, but I'm seeing a big shift in social media as well.
Yes.
And you very young people, I feel, really seeming like they're aware that they're uninformed about how to deal with death and dying. And they don't like that. Like I think a lot of people realize that it's a basic human right to know how to escort your loved ones into whatever else, through that passage, let's just say. And that we have not done a good job as a culture over the last 50, 100 years or so by removing it entirely from the living room. And just a real hunger, I do feel like it's changing, but we like being a part of that.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
I hope it goes a little bit further than that, because one thing I noticed working with hospice, yes, we're starting to get more open, right, to this dying process. But what about after death? When I first started working here, it was always, okay, Dad's died, call the mortuary, get him out of here. And I've seen a shift there as well in honoring certain traditions, Jewish tradition, bathing the body. We do a lot more of that. I had, it was actually a fellow priest and teacher that died at the Zen Center of Los Angeles. And he was in between hospices. So what do you do? Anyway, I had to call the supervisor up here to get kind of, about what are we going to do.
Right.
And anyway, that's a whole nother story. But this idea of being comfortable after death. So, for example, in our tradition, we told they were supposed to send a paramedic out and the police. And I said, no, not yet. We have a tradition. We're going to sit with the body overnight and do chanting and just be and have a service and all of that. So eventually it was the fireman said, because he was trying to push, where are you? And I said, I'm not going to tell you. And eventually he said, call us when you're ready.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, call us when you're ready. Yeah.
It's that idea of just being okay with that as well, because as a culture, we're not.
Yeah,
in most
absolutely.
cases.
We sat around and drank martinis around our grandma's body, and that felt good. And we were bereft. I mean, we were not at peace with any of that that was going on. And but it did feel good to gather together, blur ourselves just a little bit and bond over that, and kiss her goodbye and whatnot. So lots of ways to do that. There's a social media account that I follow called Paper Bark Death Care of a woman in Australia. So every country, every county, there's a lot of regulations that guide all of these things, but she's a really big proponent of natural burials and et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that she talks about is a lot about that, about providing the ritualistic space for the family to gather and mourn, and how healing that can be. For sure.
It is, and I got to share another story. Is that okay?
Yes,
Absolutely. That's what we're doing. Yeah.
A cute one. I was out at, Los Osos Cemetery, had invited people from the San Luis Obispo Ministerial Association, interfaith group, from various traditions to come in and speak to their, what their traditions are. And so we had a bunch of people, Catholic, Native American, there was a Mormon person there, Baha'i faith person was there. But basically this was a sincere effort on the cemetery's part to try to accommodate this. They said, hey, we're really comfortable now with the Jewish tradition, bathing the body and doing all these things. So they go around the table. And eventually it's my turn. And so, poker face, our tradition is sky burial, where we dismember the body, sewing body parts, and we lay them on a canvas and let the vultures come in. And as I'm doing this lady, the representative from the cemetery, her eyes keep getting,
poor thing.
and then at the end, she says, I don't think we can do that in this county.
I don't think we can do that.
So I said, kidding.
So
but
bad.
It really wasn't kidding. That's the Tibetan tradition. I mean, that is one.
Yeah.
In our tradition in Soto, it's a little bit different, but
there have been lots of traditions over the years. Yeah, absolutely. I want to just segue real quick. If you're just joining us, this is Before I Die with Steve Willey and Yanana Rozovich. We are here today talking about tending the spirit with Buddhist Reverend. Is it Reverend or priest?
Reverend. Well, the technical title, Reverend Mark Shogun Bloodgood.
I know.
Sensei.
Reverend, Buddhist Reverend.
And you can the ring
Shogun.
finger. You can kiss. Right.
Mark Bloodgood, who's here. We're not going to kiss his ring. And we are having way too much fun.
We are.
If you have any questions, please type them into the comments section, and we will do our best to address them.
Absolutely, try. Yeah. Just as a quick aside before I bring up the next topic that I'm interested in hearing you expound upon, is that in my Native American background also has a kind of sky burial where they were up on platforms and then they had a whole class of people that were their role was to go and clean the bones before interment. So they had an actual class of person that were known in the Choctaw language as bone pickers.
Yeah. Yes.
And they actually would clean what was left of the bones so that they could be interred together in the communal mound.
Well, and we're talking about the physically what to do with the body, but I think the reason why we're segueing into that is because that must have to do with how we view the end of life from a spiritual perspective, right? Like I feel like the body and the spirit are so often separated in this sort of typically Western way of looking at things. And I personally, I think they're very connected, but yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting that we're talking about tending the spirit, but we're kind of going into how are we tending the body?
Tending the body a little bit.
And you got into it initially by saying that you've noticed a shift in the course of your work with end of life in hospice, et cetera, that you've noticed a shift away, even just in our county, in our area, from immediately when somebody dies, that there's that desire to get them out and away, to being more comfortable sitting with it. So that is a super interesting shift. Yeah. I'm glad that you pointed that out.
And I think it's so telling that the space, that's allowing of space. I mean, I think even
and a rejection of fear,
and a fear of like I'm doing the wrong thing, or we need to get. I mean, there's a lot of things probably around our desire to remove our loved one's body from our house, but I think some of it are desire to go and along with the regulations, whether we know them or not.
Yeah,
we want to
it's
be
not
good
discussed,
people.
right?
We don't really talk about
Yeah,
it.
that's a really important thing.
I mean, I remember learning in hospice that you don't necessarily, when I first became involved with hospice, one of the things we learned was you don't necessarily have to call. You can stay with the body as long as you need to, for until you call the mortuary and let them know, and then let them know when you want them to come. And even my family, which is, we're not particularly, we didn't have any rituals or anything like that. But when my dad died, we wanted a little space. I mean, we just wanted a little time and a little space before they came.
There's a great social media meme, found it on Facebook, is how it crossed my path. But I saved it and I sent it out to a few people. But it's a long thing. But basically the point is, when death happens, do nothing. Really just do nothing. Just sit with it and sit and with yourself and accept whatever you're feeling, right? Which I think is super powerful, because it's the doing, right? We're just constantly trying to do. I am constantly trying. You may be less constantly trying to do, but I think it's human nature, right? And then a lot of people are sort of the extreme version of that. But just trying to get away from that. You could call that a spiritual practice.
And it is really powerful, because we try to shut this stuff up.
Yeah.
As a society. And a lot of it's just like, we don't live on farms anymore. So you don't get to see what really goes on in the farm that brings that food to us.
Right. Yeah,
or
absolutely.
the killing of chickens, that, the dying there.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the rough segue, but you mentioned earlier the phrase spiritual pain. And I am wondering if you have any thoughts on what that is, first of all, maybe, and then how you sit with spiritual pain when you're with someone who has that in their life.
Well, of course, it's going to go back again to it, that it's in an individual basis, right? What kind of pain are they suffering? Is it anxiety? Is it fear? Is it anger? And so each one's going to, take maybe a different direction in terms of dealing with that. But knowing that you would ask me that.
Oh, what a good guest you are.
Oh my gosh, you are a great guest.
I wanted to look it up. So what is spiritual pain? Because you need to have definitions, right? What are we talking about when we speak about that?
Yeah.
So there's this exhaustive study that was done fairly recently, spiritual pain, a symptom in search of a clinical definition. So they were trying to actually, they realized this is a real thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And so how, as like psychologists, how do we deal with this? How do we define it? So they came up with spiritual pain is a self-identified experience of personal discomfort or actual or potential harm triggered by a threat to a person's relationship with God or a higher power. Spiritual pain becomes clinically significant when it interferes with one's functionality and prevents one from entering the transcendent spaces of spiritual practices temporarily or permanently. So you can see that's a wide spectrum.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Super interesting.
And how do you deal with that? Yeah. So for me, again, what is their faith tradition? I would bring in one of my other colleagues to help too, if it was somebody that was perhaps more connected with their faith tradition. Being an Episcopal, we have somebody here on staff that's Episcopal, Catholic, and which biblical references do you go to? I tend to move into meditation, quiet the mind, trying to become more peaceful and explore it. Have an inquiry surrounding it.
To be curious towards the pain. Yeah.
Exactly. I don't know if that.
I think.
Steering.
No, I think that's
right
no. You are. I'm thinking about just speaking from my own experience, I have a somewhat complicated relationship with religion. I have a pretty comfortable relationship with my spirituality, although that's pretty fluid most of the time. But I can think toward my past during a time when I would have been extraordinarily fearful if I had received a terminal diagnosis. I mean, now I would be like normally fearful, like Yanana was talking about. I don't really want to go anywhere at this point, but I would understand that. I mean, I would understand it. But because of the place I was in, religiously speaking before, I would have felt very threatened. And probably fearful and probably very anxious about that. And that came from a spiritual place or a place of religion. Maybe that's more specific. So in hearing what you're saying, it's sort of that spiritual pain is the idea that sort of gets in the way of your actual relationship with your higher power or your spirituality, however you perceive that to be. Is that what I'm hearing?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting too in hospice work because at least at Wilshire we have a full team approach, right? So the social worker works with the nurse, works with the bath aide, works with the spiritual counselor, works with the musician. I'm a musician on the spiritual team. And this question of what is spiritual pain, I think is really interesting because if we have a patient, for example, who is expressing a lot of, so not expressing conflict with God, for example, they're not voicing any of that. But they do seem to be, for example, maybe chronically angry or chronically fearful. We think about the question of, well, that can be spiritual pain, right? It can be physical pain too. I guess we sort of lump like emotional and spiritual pain in together, but I have certainly seen, as a musician, how bringing beauty into the room in the form of music, for example, how it can soften us, and it doesn't have to specifically be a conversation around, are you afraid of what's going to happen after you die? Or are you afraid of your relationship with God? Or, what's the conflict going on? It can be done through just that softening. And if they, I ask before I play a hymn, for example. I know a lot of hymns from the Christian tradition. But if the person, I'll sort of say, do you have a relationship with hymns or, church music? And if they say, well, when I was a child or whatever, I'll offer. And if they want to hear some, and it's amazing how much can be done through listening to a hymn that your grandmothers sang to you, through that your ancestors sang to you when you were young. I often will try to, I'd say pretty much always in my work, will try to connect someone to their ancestors through music. So that's often that's the music that they heard when they were quite young. So there's a full circle healing connection. And then often the religious background or the sort of the spirituality idea can be brought into the equation that way. So I'm not articulating it super well, but I'm just thinking we have in our interdisciplinary team discussions this idea of, is that spiritual pain, someone with a lot of conflict around a divorce that they went through, losing their children or their children that have passed on. So it doesn't always voice itself, is my point,
right.
in, I don't know if God loves me or whatever, that many examples of spiritual pain could be.
Trouble relationships, like all these things that you'd mentioned, can be part of that. And what do you do with that? What do you do?
Well, I think having it addressed, like you were saying, it's an individual case, right? And just being present with it, having it addressed, and being surrounded by people who, just can hold it
and be okay with it.
Yeah,
be okay with it. And I have just seen so many times the music. people, they're like this around these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And music starts softening that.
Mm-hmm.
And they can become more spacious,
Yeah,
more expansive. And that's powerful.
absolutely.
And
Or
to
more
watch
accepting.
watch
Yeah.
that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think in
And-
any situation like that that's fraught with so much, music can just sort of even it creates that space, especially if it's like, you know, music that you're connected with already, and you know, it really can open up the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always said, I think the music is one of the most powerful tools hospice has. Yes, nurses, it's all important. All the medical things
Absolutely,
are
yes.
important. But the
Yeah.
things I've seen through the music program have been just amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And be a part of that. I used to go out with one of our other musicians, Tim,
Yeah.
on a regular basis,
Yeah.
which was my chance to sing.
Yeah. So great.
Not always accepted by him. I admit this. And my attempt at harmonizing. But the point being is that, how that softens people up.
Mhm.
And I think it allows them to then explore these things. You know, what is the issue? Was it a troubled relationship?
Mhm.
Is it a specific religious issue with God? You know,
Mhm.
God's turned his back on me. You know, where is he when I need him?
Mhm.
Those kinds of things.
Why
But
am I?
they
Why
can-
am I still
Why
here?
am I still
Yeah.
here?
That's
We
a
hear
big
that.
one.
That's a
Yeah.
big one. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, people are ready. Sometimes sometimes they're just ready to go, and it just doesn't happen.
How many times do we get asked that question?
Yeah.
You know, what's going on?
Yeah.
And it's always, you know, sometimes the body is not ready. Mine's ready to go.
And
then
that's your mind.
conversely, it's the other way. It's like, I don't want to go.
Yeah.
But the body,
The
is,
body is
shutting down.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always such a balance. I mean, you know, even outside of the hospice world, and the situations that I've been honored to be a part of, it's always that, how do you create that balance, you know, in the room, in the relationships, you know, in the expectations, and how do you honor the space that the dying person is in, and still hold yourself, you know, true to yourself.
And that's why I used what I call the 3 tenets with every visit. And the 3 tenets, not knowing, bearing witness, and taking action, appropriate action.
Mhm.
So this idea of not knowing, the not knowing mind. So that's a mind that leaves all your stuff outside,
Yeah.
coming in, dropping your opinions, your judgments. Not easy to do.
Mm-mm.
But to try to come in with that, you know, as we say, the beginner's mind, but we call it the not knowing mind. And from that point, you bear witness on what's going on in this moment. The patient, you may have thought, well, I've been with this patient many, many times, maybe a couple of months. I know this guy, this person. So I've got my repertoire. I know what I'm going to do. You drop that. No, you don't. You come into that situation new each time. And the equation with this is coming from a point of not knowing and bearing witness, really exploring what's going on. Not solution, but an action arises on its own. And I don't know if that makes sense at all. We would have,
Yeah.
I had, you know, one patient I can remember did not want to do anything about religion. I don't want a chaplain over here. Somehow I think maybe it was the social worker opened the door. You know, Mark's a nice guy, you know, just talk to him. So we come in, and what do we end up doing? Watching old reruns of NCIS. And that's what opened this guy up, and we had this wonderful relationship until he passed. And another woman was a devout, card-carrying atheist, and she had already told everybody, I don't want any Bible thumpers over here. No. Keep away. Somehow I was able to get the phone call into her, and she said, honey, you know, I don't need any of this God stuff. And we rarely, as chaplains, ever like expose our own faith tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But in that case, on a rare occasion, I call it the Zen Buddhist card. And I said, well, that's interesting. I'm a Zen Buddhist priest, and we're not into the God thing either. Pause. You're a Zen Buddhist priest? Honey, why don't you come over?
Let's have a cup of tea and
that
chat.
was, and you talk about somebody spiritual. Some of the atheists I've known are the most spiritual people I've ever met in my life. So that launched this wonderful relationship. She was at Judson Terrace and moved eventually, as she was, declining, moved across to a skilled nursing facility across the street.
Mm-hmm.
And then it became, I would go in and advocate to get a cigarette. She was a smoker. And of course you cannot smoke in the facility.
Oh my gosh.
Put her in her wheelchair. We'd go up on the sidewalk on the street, and we had these unbelievable conversations, just unbelievable. And was she spiritual?
Yeah. That's actually, I wanted to go a little bit deeper even into this, because what I just heard in what you were just talking about, I could hear you saying around spirituality, around end of life spirituality, you were able to incorporate a television show, a smoking break, just general visits, just to talk about stuff, just visiting, just being Mark, and even bringing your spiritual path in as a way to kind of wedge your foot into the door, which none of those things are what you would kind of consider to be traditional spirituality earmarks at the end of life. I mean, I think that's not what most people would think of when we talk about tending the spirit at the end of life. I don't think a smoke break comes to mind immediately.
Right. But everything that we've been through, positively and negatively, has affected us spiritually as well. So, I mean, we carry that all with us into that end of life time. Yeah.
And just to be clear, since I've two of the people that I would prefer to have at my side when I'm dying, I don't have to drink the coffee necessarily, but if you could just put a pot of coffee on the stove
to
smell it, and so I can know it's there,
so good.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Just put that in your little notebook
That's
of how
so
to take
important.
care of Steve at the end of life.
It's really just showing up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it really
And listen.
Mm-hmm.
What's being expressed verbally or not.
Non-verbally. I was
Yeah.
just, when you said listen, I was just seeing this patient's eyes. There's so much that you can tell from the eyes. And that's a good segue. The coffee was a good segue into something that I wanted to ask you about, which is around the general topic of bringing beauty into the room of the dying, or into just that end of life time. When I say that, what comes up for you? What comes to mind?
The music program is bringing that in, but so many aspects. Again, as part of the process, when you've met with the dying, many, many times over, we're doing life reviews, of course.
Yeah.
So you're discerning what has been important in this person's life. I have read so much poetry to the dying as another form of beauty.
Mm-hmm.
I don't work here anymore now, so I can say this. Being with nature, we had a gentleman, and part of my routine was to visit his house, but we would go out in his wheelchair, and we'd walk around the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
He was also an avid hiker.
Yeah.
So his wife one time took him out to Montana de Oro, and we put him in a wheelchair. And it was after they had made it handicap accessible, the Bluff Trail.
Yeah.
And we walked the entire Bluff Trail.
Wow. That's amazing.
And he was, this was home for him.
Yeah.
And he just lit up.
Yeah, so much. I feel like that this idea of bringing beauty into the end of life conversation, just like setting that as an intention equal to the medications and the specific circumstances. Where do you want to be, and who are your caregivers, and all of the wrapping up your financial matters. I feel like we need that to be at the forefront, and I we don't do a good job of that our entire lives. Right. I try. That's like one of my missions, in my life, and any opportunity I have to sort of talk about that. But particularly at the end of life, when everything becomes so much more weighted, isn't the right word, like just so much more heightened.
Yes.
Right?
It's definitely heightened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's so important.
Yeah.
Let's start early.
Yes.
Let's start early. Back to your point.
I do my...
The fire on the head. The fire on the...
fire. Right now.
I start every one of my Dharma talks, that you do a welcome thing, usually, and it's, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, all you Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and Sangha treasures and you future corpses. Mm. Now, that's kind of tongue-in-cheek as I'm doing a talk. Yeah. But is it really?
Is it really?
Now,
yeah, no.
I never use that line on a hospice patient.
Right.
No.
Right.
They already knew that.
Yeah.
That was a given. But
yeah.
Most of us need to wake up to this fact. I was living in a mortuary while I was in college for a while, and I can remember, and I'd never been...
So big surprise there.
So where were you living in the mortuary?
In the mortuary. And my kitchenette shared a wall with the embalming room. So before this was in college, and I was in a fraternity and decided, that's just not for me. I'm going to leave. So I went, anyway, that was fine. And I grabbed my surfboard, and then I was out in the administration building, and saw that there was this ad to live in a mortuary. Well, at this point, and I'm in college.
Yeah.
Nobody in the family had died. I had great-grandparents Graham lived to 102. Nobody had died in the family at that point. And I'd never been to a funeral. So anyway, long story short, or to shorten it up, I'm living at the mortuary, and we get what's called a first call, and that's when you go pick up the deceased. And we weren't doing in the mortuary I lived in the San Fernando Valley, they weren't doing the embalming work there. They were doing it at a cemetery up in Sunland, Tahunga. And so I get this call, and it's going to go to pick up the deceased at a hospital. Ironically, that hospital was the same hospital that my oldest daughter was born in later years. So I go in, and the body is in a box like this. It's an infant that had died. And so I dutifully drive it up to the other place and walk into the embalming room, and there are bodies, six or eight bodies all over. One of them has come from General, and she's cut open. She'd had all of her internal organs removed. She's jaundiced, and she's the exact same age as my mother was at the time. Well, I went home that night, and I did not sleep.
Oh, God, that not.
And with the realization, I'm going to be on one of those slabs one of these days.
This can happen.
Yeah. Did you get adequate preparation for that job? I'm really feeling like so protective of the 19-year-old Mark who just answered a room for rent sign. And that just sounds, like a lot.
Yeah, no preparation.
Oh, for goodness.
But it does feels like part of, it feels like a normal part of that journey, the journey that I know you've been on.
It's your story.
It's really,
absolutely.
It's really an authentic part of your story. I mean, I feel like that. I mean, when you talk about that, it reminds me that my dad, who was a fireman, also had a part-time job for a while, picking up the bodies and taking them to the mortuary. And I it was probably only once or twice, but I was quite young. I don't know, maybe 8 or 7 or 6 or something. But I remember doing ride-alongs at least one time in this process, and being in the mortuary with the caskets. And I don't recall ever seeing any bodies really, but because I don't think my parents would have gone for that. But I was in the environment a lot as a very young child, and I think in some ways, I mean, I that your story really resonates with me on having been there in that environment, and maybe that had an effect on who we are today.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well. That's part of your story.
Isn't that odd?
Yeah.
Well, it's also part of the Buddhist story. When he comes out of the palace and confronts old age, sickness, and death. And that starts him on his spiritual journey.
Yeah.
Or the Dogen Zenji, who was the founder of Japanese Soto Zen. He lived 1200 to 1253. But his moment was his mother died when he was 7 years old, and at the funeral, he's watching the smoke come up off the incense and disappear. And he's really struck with her death and this looking at the incense of the impermanence of life.
Mm-hmm.
And that drives him on his spiritual quest.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. Like it seems so essential. Like clearly those experiences were essential to the people that you've become. We've talked before about my experiences with death when I was younger, and it's never a real, well, for me it certainly wasn't a direct path to end up working with death and dying as an older person. It certainly, it wasn't my plan, That wasn't my plan. But it strikes me as how essential contact with mortality in its most obvious form with the dead body can lead to a spiritual path in life. Yeah. I love that you brought that back to the story of Buddha, because I wouldn't have known that. And that just makes me go, actually, that sounds really central to human experience.
It does.
Right. And it also gets back to that thing that we're trying to sort of, counteract in our culture, where we've gotten so removed from death and dying. And we're actively, you and I are actively trying to help in this conversation to normalize the conversation around death and dying. But I feel like a big part of that is really what's happened to how we don't have death in front of us anymore. And we don't want it in front of us anymore. And then generations go by and we're like, wait, something's missing. We're not, it's almost like it's a spiritual disorientation, if you will, because we're not having death in front of us anymore.
It's a break.
Super interesting.
It's a break. And of course, as we intellectually know, there is no life without death. I mean, the two are inseparable. Yeah. And the more that we can learn to die, I think the more alive we are in life.
Mm-hmm.
That it makes a huge difference. There's such a freedom to it as well. Not pushing it aside, not ignoring it.
Well, it does take a certain amount of effort to ignore it. Although our whole culture is on board with it, so it's been sort of like streamlined.
I think, we've talked about this before, but that the energy that takes to move away from death can be exhausting. I mean, the amount of energy that it takes to deny or to ignore it or whatever, it's like you're really investing a lot of energy and emotion into probably much more than you would be if you were actually just talking about it. Right. I mean, does that make
existential angst?
Yeah,
is what it can create.
Yeah,
by ignoring.
Yeah,
rather than embracing.
AKA spiritual pain.
I was just going to say.
So we're all which totally makes sense, right? Because if this is what our culture has done, I would say most people have a realm of spiritual pain. AKA existential angst, because we haven't haven't had that up close and gone through those cycles.
I mean, that's really
Enough.
why we have you here, because I mean, our little line at the beginning is that, we really believe that talking about death and the experience of death and dying really can open us up. It really does invite us to live deeper, richer, and more meaningful lives. And we say that all the time, and it's sort of a tagline, but that's really, I mean, that's kind of it. I mean, that's what we're hoping to, drag people into and keep reminding ourselves.
If you're just joining us, this is Before I Die with Steve Willey and Yanana Rosovich. We are here today with Buddhist Reverend Mark Bloodgood, and we're talking about tending the spirit at the end of life. If you have any questions, please type them into the comments, and we will do our best to address them.
I want to know this, and this is probably something that we've been talking about all of the time since you've been here, but I would like to know if you have any thoughts, or if you've given any thought to how being so intimately involved with death and dying that you've been in both in your personal life, but also in your spiritual life, how has that how has that affected the meaning in your own life? How does that affected the way that you live your own life? And can you think of ways to talk about that? How that's informed the way that you live?
Certainly, that's the case. And in my own tradition, we do a lot of vows. And numberless beings, I vow to serve them. And we also come up with personal vows. So my teacher years ago did a class on living by vow, and we created our own personal vows. And I came up with two, and one was to serve others. And that was before we had changed the one of our 4 bodhisattva vows, we call them, numberless beings, and it used to be I vow to save them. And we thought that was too much of a, not that Christianity is wrong at all, but it had too much of a flavor of, I'm going to convert. And we don't do that. So we made it to serve. But before we had done that, I had already come up with this. I vow to serve them however that manifests. And this, this path, it has manifested in multiple ways throughout the course of my life. It's been amazing. The prison work, work with the homeless, the hospice work as a priest. It's just all these things, and I'm sure that's true in all of our lives. Things just manifest all the time. Maybe it's just a smile at somebody that wasn't expecting to smile. And then the second was to live simply. And that is a process to not live a cluttered life, not live a life full of attachments. Let it go. And that's been that's been a result of this path. And it's been life altering, certainly.
That's powerful.
Another manifestation that just hit that I'd shared with you, Steve, too. I'll be going to India and Bangladesh, and I'm with a group now, and they have this wonderful outreach. It's a foundation, and we take money from that foundation and channel it into various projects, mostly third world projects throughout the world. What a great manifestation.
Yeah.
It's just really something.
And that's where that energy goes. That energy that we spend denying, and that we spend walking away from death, and that we spend, trying not to think about death, that energy can be channeled somewhere else. I personally, it's the work that we do here. It's the education that I do. I know, and I'm just going to say it's probably a lot of it's in your music.
Yeah.
I just feel like there's so many positive outcomes in those manifestations, and thank you for like that image, because that's really kind of how it feels.
So what you're saying is when you let go of the energy that it takes to deny death and soften in your relationship towards it and welcome it in, then you have more energy to put towards manifestations,
Right.
Pursuing your joy. Mine is music, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. That's a really interesting. Yeah, that's a really interesting.
The energy
concept.
is all there.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't go. I'm no physicist, but the energy just feels like it exists all the time. So you have to put it somewhere, And if it's all bundled up in avoidance and fear and anxiety.
Fear takes an enormous amount of energy, right? So, yeah. So the idea of like trying to normalize this conversation is an attempt to. I want to say evaporate, but that's a little too, it's a little too clever. Like we could do that, right? But yeah, lessen the fear and anxiety around it, right? Which gives more energy for other things.
And I see there's a little bit of a process here that maybe we're touching on, and you become less selfish. There's less emphasis on this as you start letting go. And then, for my tradition,
it's a hard one.
It's what do we when we talk about awakening or enlightenment, and what are we awakening to? Well, one of my teachers, Roshi Bernie Glassman, said it was awakening to the interconnectedness of life. And when you start feeling that, it's almost like, well, this is a no-brainer. They are me. I am them.
Wow.
We need to help one another.
Yeah.
So awakening to the interconnectedness of all of us in life. That feels like that's our kind of wrap-up line.
It's like, oh, that's such a good ending line.
It's like, everybody be quiet.
And we're coming to our end. Yeah.
We are about out of time. I want to thank you so much, Mark, for agreeing to come in and spending time with us. It's like a blast, and we'll probably have to have you back. And thanks to you, Tianana, for doing these together with me.
So much fun.
Really so much fun.
Yeah. Isn't it cool?
Yeah, it is.
Very fun.
So just to kind of quickly wrap things up, do you think we can normalize this? Do you think we can normalize talking about death and dying in our culture?
Yes.
We're trying.
Or we say, as we often say with the teachers talking to a student, just keep going.
Yeah.
I guess that's it. I guess that means we'll be back next month.
Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. This is Before I Die from Wilshire. I forgot our little tagline. We'll be back next month on August 17th, talking about Reminiscence and Life Review with Ingrid Piers, bereavement counselor. We are on YouTube Live and also Facebook at Wilshire Health and Community Services. Thanks so much, everybody. See you then.
Thanks. Thank you very much. And thank you again, Mark.
So welcome.
Yeah. So it's always really super nice